Hello, everyone. Hi, thanks so much for coming out today on this wet and windy day. My name is Leila Elmus and I'm the City Historian here at the City of Sydney. And on behalf of the history team, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting today. I acknowledge that we are working and creating on country on the unceded lands of the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation, and I pay my sincere respects to their elders past and present. So I am going to go through a little bit of housekeeping, and this is really for those of you who are joining us online. So if we could get that slide up, or is that something that I do? Sorry, that. Okay, so we are recording today's talk. If you're joining us from home, you're going to be viewing on what's called a webinar, and the best way to view that is fit to window. This talk is being interpreted to Auslan, and thank you very much to our Auslan interpreter for joining us today. If you're joining us from home, if you could please ask any questions via the Q&A button, which is shown on the screen grab on the slide there. At the end of the talk, we're going to put up a slide with a QR code for a culture count survey. Please let us know your thoughts. We'll also email this out to everyone who attended the talk today, and we'd love to hear what you think about the talk and what we can do better or what was great. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers. But I'd also like to just give a bit of a preamble about why we're giving the talk today. So it's Heritage Festival, and the city's history team with our wonderful programming team has coordinated a series of 3 talks that focus on the history of Darlinghurst. And these talks tie in with a recently published book about the history of Darlinghurst, which is called My Darlinghurst. And this book was edited by Anna Clark, Tamsin Peach and Gabrielle Pechemis, and it's published by the University of New South Wales. And I believe you can probably get a copy of the book via interlibrary loan if you so wish, although I did check and it looked like it was booked out. So you might have to go on a list to have a look at that one. So our talk today is being presented by Dr. Lisa Murray, and Lisa is the former city historian and my colleague for just over a decade. And she's going to be presenting today with Dr. Paula Hamilton, who's an oral historian, academic, and actually did teach me at the University of Technology, Sydney. So they're going to be talking to you about sound and noise in Darlinghurst. So I'll let them take it away. Thanks so much.
Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today and talk about a kind of heritage that's perhaps you might not have thought about beyond buildings and objects. A heritage that's related to literally airy-fairy or intangible sound and noise. To do this, we have to ask the first question. What is sound and how is it different to noise? How has sound shaped the history of human experience? And how does it get turned into something that's intrusive, noxious, and undesirable? Take jazz, for example, that we were listening to when we came in. We think of it now as a genre of musical sound, but like rock and roll, a few decades after it, many thought it was the sound of the devil himself. It's a man, the devil. The syncopated rhythms and high energy motion that became associated with modern life, they thought of it as the most terrible racket, as a horrible noise, as an assault on the ears, while others didn't. Some of them embraced the new. Sound was something, of course, that we heard and listened to, but it's also something that everyone makes, though not all of us are Benny Goodman or Duke Ellington. And since we have perceived, what we perceive as noise varies from person to person and across time, we understand noise broadly as a category of what we call broadly unwanted sound. And as I say, we both hear sound and noise and we produce it as we move across space. Shh, stop making a noise, we say to the kids. And what I mean by across time is that the sounds we hear today is not the same soundscape as those of yesteryear. We no longer hear the sounds, for example, of horses straining to carry carts up hills, pulling cabs around. What was so commonplace in earlier times, the sound of horses' hooves. Even later, my father, who was a mechanic in the 40s and 50s, could tell what was wrong with a Holden by just listening to the engine. I wonder if you can do this today with computerized car systems or electric cars. Perhaps mechanics can still. And what I mean, but sound is intensely localised. And Lisa and I have chosen to focus on a local environment, that of Darlinghurst, to show how people experienced noise and sound after World War I. One thing we need to be aware of, though, is that noise and sound are just one of the senses. And here we have Kenneth Slessor talking about, in his wonderful poetic, lyrical expressions, what was in fact a multi-sensorial landscape. In other words, people smelled and heard and saw, and they touched and they tasted Darlinghurst. But our focus today is on sound because, like sight, it has had the most impact on experience, arguably, of course. Was Darlinghurst an increasingly noisy place to live and work in from the 1920s? Well, certainly many of the residents, visitors and passers-by thought so, and they complained long and loudly to the Municipal Council of Sydney to do something about it. Moreover, complaints about it were not particular to the period or even Australia. Several large cities around the world experienced generalised anxieties about increased noise in the interwar period. At this time, there was no such thing as a regular definition of an offensive noise, nor was it possible to measure noise in decibels. So decibels were actually invented in 1920. So it takes a while for that measurement to become to get into official use. But noise came to be central to ideas about order, disorder, and discipline in the city. And it was often mentioned in contrast to the quiet of the suburban living in the outer suburbs and the peace of rural life. But sound, as we say, is elusive. It's transient. It doesn't stay with us except in the memory. If we remember it, we can remember sound, but if we don't record it for posterity, it's gone. There are many ways of listening and difference of access and control over what one hears. Sometimes you listen and sometimes you don't listen to sound or noise. Sound is also no respecter of boundaries. It's capable of bleeding across man-made definitions of space, like suburb delineating lines on a map, or fences or walls, as you will all know. Okay, so therefore, how do we know about the sounds of the past? If we only know them through recorded sound, how do we know about them? How do we know what people objected to and found places too noisy? In our period, a recorded range of sound is very limited. We do have the American music, of course, which they were avidly recording from the 1910s and 20s. But even with new technology, people didn't think to record everyday sounds. Even now, recording ambient landscapes is a limited practice by the National Film and Sound Archive. Now, Lisa is just going to step in briefly and talk to us about what kind of sources we used for this project.
So Paul has sort of set up how it's very difficult sometimes to recollect or think about sound and remember sound. It is, as she said, elusive and transient. So it is a challenge to research what we would call sensory history. There are, of course, a few early radio broadcasts that survive, but there are not many. So, and they're often very structured and pre-recorded. The ambient sounds really don't exist. So we have to rely on written records. And that, of course, means that as historians, we have to look at these written sources and also read them very carefully and use our imagination as well. But as Paula said, people complained, and Sydney Municipal Council has an extraordinary collection of letters that date right back to when it was formed in 1842, and their archive continues right through into the 20th and 21st century. So we can look at the letters of complaint that were written to the council. We can also look at the more other official files of the council to see how they were trying to deal with noise and what they might be doing to regulate noise. We can also see people's responses to noise in the newspapers. They wrote to the newspapers. It was like the Twitter. How many people complain on Twitter or X? Lots of them. Well, they did that in the newspapers in the early 20th century. So we can read a lot of letters. We can also read journalists' coverage of the issues. Parliamentarians debated it in state parliament. So we can also look at those debates and see what's current. And then people describe sounds, not only through like journalism, but also through their autobiographies. So we can look at people who lived through these times, read their autobiographies and get a sense of how they experienced their world. And so we use both non-fiction and I suppose fiction as well, not only autobiographies, which are, you know, both nonfiction and I would argue somewhat fictionalized in how people like to present themselves, but also through fiction written at the time that's set in contemporary times. You can also use that to recreate the sensory environment. And of course, as Paul has mentioned, we need to consider the particularity of the place. So we're studying Darlinghurst, and of course we had to look to the locality, to look to the topography, the landscape, to see how that might affect the sounds that would be in a place at a certain time. So I'm going to hand back to Paula now, who's going to start telling you a bit more about Darlinghurst and its particular situation.
So we say each place has its own particular soundscape. You will live somewhere which it has its own soundscape. But what I'm going to do is take you on a journey to reimagine that sensory and emotional experience of Darlinghurst. Darlinghurst's physical shape, its topography, was crucial to the sound environment. Located high on a ridge overlooking the city to the west, up the Darlow Hill of William Street, it was bounded by Woolloomooloo Bay down in the dip or the hollow, and harbour wharves on the north, and to the south, the Oxford Street thoroughfare, which separated it from Surrey Hills. The King's Cross area stood as a kind of no man's land between Darlinghurst and Potts Point, with Elizabeth Bay and Rushcutters Bay to the east. Sounds from the wharves at Woolloomooloo would travel across the valley. On a still night, and there were important differences between the day and the night sounds, ferry horns could be heard, where you could hear ferry horns during the day, but they travelled more at night. And the loading of cargo ships disturbed people's sleep. On the other side, the sounds from sporting contests, usually boxing, coming from the stadium, which was built in 1908 at Rushcutters Bay, could also be heard. The jeers and cheers of the crowd filtering across the suburb. Now it's more likely to be a Taylor Swift concert, but hey. Apart from the natural environment, hills, ridges, valleys, the man-made environment also contributed to the particularity of Darlinghurst during the interwar period. Originally a suburb where the wealthy had built mansions on the hill to overlook the surrounding areas, by the 1920s, the composition of people who lived there had diversified considerably. The small cottages by the wharves and the Victorian terraces, this is a map of Darlinghurst, which you can see the Woolloomooloo wharves and down Elizabeth Bay. The small cottages and the Victorian terraces stretching up to Oxford Street, many of whom are still there, were populated by working class communities of Irish, English, Maltese, Italians and Greeks. Boarding houses in wide late Victorian terraces lined William Street, servicing a growing population of single men and women working in the city. There were many living cheaply in large housing converted to boarding house, for example. Journalist and bohemian Dulcie Demas' first room when she arrived in 1923 was in one of the old derelict mansions, gradually being pulled down to make way for flats, in which there were human rabbit warrens where the hard up cooked and quarrelled and loved. Sorry, excuse me, where plywood partitions divided dignified rooms. And for her, this mansion had a comic fairy tale quality where gramophones tinkled and somebody had tragically, Dulcie says, dropped a bottle of cheap wine in the entrance hall, and children shouted as they played cricket between the damaged statues. Wonderful. Imagining that is wonderful, isn't it? The 2 up and 2 down terraces that lined Riley, Crown, Palmer, Burke and Forbes Street gave little privacy, boarding houses and brothels even less so. So we can see some of these. This is in 1916, 1927. B. Miles, that wonderful Sydney eccentric, lived in one of the rooms of a large terrace house in Victoria Street, Darlinghurst. It had 14 rooms, for example, right? She never cooked. She lived on beer and oysters, as you do. She had a tiny attic room on the top floor. Darlinghurst was an ideal location for many writers and artists. It offered a variety of accommodation through this breakup of large houses and the rise of flats. B wrote lovingly of Sunday mornings in Victoria Street, Darlow, when I would stand on the roof outside my attic and listen to the bells of St Mary's Cathedral booming and swinging with the wind across Woolloomooloo Valley. Another beautiful image. Rose Ellis, B's biographer, mentions aspiring writers and actors like Peter Finch and Chips Rafferty, Mary Gilmore, and writers like Mary Gilmore, and we've seen Kenneth Slessor, who all lived nearby in the suburb. But these stood beside the many mansions converted to boarding houses on the top of the ridge. The 1920s and 30s saw a proliferation of flats built within walking distance of the city central. Many of them housed the new workforces in offices, shops and factories. The Sydney Council was not subject to state housing regulations at this time, and there was a lack of planning control. Now, where have I heard that before? Over their height and spatial dimensions. Flats built by the speculators were perceived as a new form of cheap housing, goodness, and regarded by many as undermining domesticity and the suburban ideal. I can't underestimate the importance and the sense of flats being something that people had never experienced before. Flat building of this intense nature was the cause of considerable noise, and the rapid uptake by renters a considerable cause for alarm. This was especially so since the majority of the accommodation in places like Darlinghurst were small bachelor flats. Now let's look at the impact of modernity on Darlinghurst. As many of those original villas I'm describing were repurposed, their garden estates were being subdivided to make way for new apartment buildings, some of which were absolutely beautiful and luxurious in the modern style. And they're still there today. So this is Byron Hall, built by Claude Hamilton, 9799 Macleay Street in 1920. And the grand entrance hall that you see there, and the photo's taken actually in the 70s or something, is still there. And on the right, or your left or whatever, is the twin Statler and Hopes buildings. That was taken in 1964. And these were built, there was also, I'm having trouble with the, there was also the, sorry, I'm having trouble with the, yeah. Now this was built by Claude Hamilton, no relation, unfortunately, in 1920. And here's the design from the State Library. So one of the first was King's Clear, at the corner of Macleay Street and Greenknoll Avenue. And this paved the way for King's Cross to become the great apartment district, as agents called it, selling the cosmopolitan dream. Carolyn Butler Bowden, who is now the head of the State Library, wrote her doctorate on these apartment buildings. The effect in Darlinghurst was to create a vertical soundscape of varying kinds of domestic noise for the first time. Outside in public space, the blocks of flats created something like an echo chamber. The flats had been built about shops and workplaces below, and the noise from the streets was amplified up through to the small balconies and the flat windows, particularly nighttime activities. In fact, by the 1930s, Darlinghurst was the most densely populated district in the city. There was, of course, next slide, lorry and motorcycle, there was, of course, car, lorry and motorcycle amplifying traffic noise. But there was a long in-between period when horses were side by side with traffic, but they were gradually replaced. It's actually quite difficult to find images where you've got both horses and cars together, even though I know, for example, that even in the 60s, Balmain had a horse and cart that was still sort of a residual form of transport. But even horses were affected by noise. One attached to a cab at the top of William Street in 1919, right, bolted because of thunder and a hailstorm. It went careering down the street, missing people by inches because the sound of thunder and hail meant they couldn't hear it coming. You can imagine. The cab was smashed to smithereens and the horse was seriously injured. Now, what's interesting about that story is that we're talking 1919, but by the middle to late 30s, we've actually got a landscape that's full of trams and buses and cars. So it's a huge amount of change in a very short period of time. However, at the time, radio had a wider, so we also have the, alongside the transition of motorised traffic began to hold sway. The residents and businesses of Darlinghurst were flanked, remember, by two major thoroughfares, Oxford Street with its Friday night shopping crowds and William Street with its pawn shops and businesses. Between 1910 and 1916, Oxford and William Streets were widened by the council to increase the flow of trams and motor vehicles. The top of William Street, and some of you will remember this, became a confluence of routes and thoroughfares to the east and the south of the city, with blaring motor horns, noisy exhausts, screeching brakes, slamming of doors. Electrified trams alongside Oxford and William Street added to this grinding noise of trams turning from the steep hill up William Street into the King's Cross intersection. And there were clanging bells, you can imagine. From all my reading about this period, I am still astonished at the intensity of the experience of the modern being played out in this suburb. Because it was the advent of the modern, they called it, they believed that noise was integral to the emergence of modern life, and it became a constant feature, not simply intermittent. And what revealed this most was the recklessness and frequency of the parties and the partying, right? This is from these two photographs are from the Hood collection. Thomas Hood was so brilliant, Sam Hood, sorry, was so brilliant at documenting the everyday life. And he's documenting revelry at this time. There's a whole section on balls and drunken parties. We don't know who these are, but the Bohemians were very fond of dress-up parties. Making noise seemed to be the spirit of the age, perhaps due to the number of single people living in flats, and there was a constant reference to the single bachelor girls, the modern girl, who were leaving their homes to live in flats and work in the city. The modern girl of the cartoon stereotype with her 1920s bob and shorter dresses. But there was a recklessness about the parties, which seemed to reflect a kind of zeitgeist response in the interwar period. Kenneth Slessor recalled, quote, the disc-smashing parties, which were popular in the 30s. The host would provide piles of old played-out records, those which bored him most, and the guests would shatter them over each other's heads until they were ankle-deep in vulcanite. He also described the house cooling parties, which were held the day before old mansions were to be demolished, at which partygoers, and I quote, were invited to lend a hand by sawing doors in halves, pulling up wainscoting and ripping the wallpaper down in strips. A newspaper account of a visit to Darlinghurst in midnight in 1928 described it as a mad place of lunatic, febrile, rushing, perspiring action. Alongside public noise, radio and music were also weaving their way into people's domestic lives, as you can hear of this wonderful description of someone going up in a lift. Now, this is a journalist, right? And what you get is this, because they used to write wonderfully in those days, journalists, and you can see it reflects the strangest of living in a vertical way as he goes up, right? And he hears jazz and opera and jazz and opera. So radio came to Australia in 1923. The commercial broadcasters went on air in 1925, and the ABC set up in 1932. And this is where the blurring of public and private noise begins to take place seriously. Radio retailers campaigned from the mid-1920s, urging the individual buyers of sets, and early broadcasts were transmitted by loudspeakers in public and commercial spaces. So this is someone, one of the radio commercial radio people trying to get your average Joe to buy a radio, but the private license fee of 10 shillings was prohibitively expensive. So many formed groups of communal listening through a loudspeaker, especially to cricket sports transmissions. Groups also gathered, I don't know what's happened here. Groups also gathered outside shops and churches who scheduled sermons and services, with broadcasts blaring out into the street. Can't imagine a religious broadcast blaring out into the street, but that's what happened. The calling of racehorses by well-known sports commentator Cyril Angles became a kind of background, urgent tonal garble. And in the 1930s, he called 30 to 60 races a week, which is pretty amazing. You can imagine what sort of voice he had. However, at the time, radio had a wider impact in relation to music because it encouraged the spread of recorded music through the gramophone. And you can see what Kenneth Slessor's friends did with gramophone records. Over 1 million gramophones had been sold in Australia by the mid-1920s. Modern music imported from America, which you heard coming in, particularly became associated with public noise. And as I said, especially the emergence of jazz. Many of the complaints about noise in Darlinghurst during the period were made by those who objected to the noises of parties and women shouting, music or revelry, and drunken violence of various kinds. it was so prevalent that Darlinghurst became known as the party place, which stood alongside its equally strong reputation as a place of crime and prostitution. It'd be interesting to note the ways they were linked. Okay, so I'll just give you one little example before I depart. At 3 a.m. in June, on a day in June, night in June 1929, Jean Alexander, who was a proprietress of Darlington Hall Flats, goes to answer her front door, and this is 3 a.m. in the morning, and there's a man standing there with blood coming from his head. She goes back up to the flat with him that he was in, and the place is in the most ghastly condition. All the furniture's broken, everything's all over the place. And basically he had a party which got out of hand, and then he had a huge row with a seaman, so from Woolloomooloo. Okay, that same night, police go to the door of a flat in another building where a woman answers only in a singlet, saying that she was expecting someone else. They were looking for a stolen blue hat. This is my blue hat story. She was convicted for offensive behaviour. God knows what she did. But anyway, and they later found the stolen hat. So brawling and thieving were really quite common. So while at first the diversity of new sounds in the interwar period were tolerated, by the late 1940s, the novelty had well and truly worn off. Even for the flat dwellers were complaining. So I'll leave it there and move on to how we regulated that noise.
So, noise, as Paula has described it, was both a domestic issue, but also a public issue. But whatever its source, it was really hard to regulate. For the Sydney Municipal Council, they constantly struggled with the legislation that defined for them their powers and what they were allowed to regulate. The 1875 Nuisances Prevention Act, such a fantastic name, allowed the council to regulate nuisances however they wanted to define them via bylaws. Until the early 20th century, that really meant that they focused on sanitation, emissions, smells, water pollution, animals, and buildings that were considered unfit for human habitation. The City Council was also empowered to regulate public places, particularly parks and sporting grounds, and also the street. So this slide we can see here shows some buskers on Darlinghurst Road. And a number of journalists remember in the 1920s how the streets were full of unemployed servicemen, and many of them busked to earn some money. There were lots of groups of 3 or 4 uniformed men in old forage caps playing violins, cornets, clarinets, and one of them whose job it was to beg for a penny for an old digger. So the sounds of the street were not only sounds of traffic and retail, but also other sounds as well of the hawkers, the buskers. 3 bylaws became crucial for trying to regulate noise in the early 20th century. Bylaws 518, 519 and 520. And these dealt with street gatherings and noises, including violent outcry, shouting, or noisy musical instruments. So you can see this is really about public noise and disturbance. So many street vendors and hawkers, you know, the baker, the milkman, the rabbitoh, the newsboys, they projected their voices to advertise their wares as they wandered the streets. They all ran the gauntlet of Bylaw 518. Here's a cartoon from 1929 Hush. Says down the bottom, the civic commissioners have unearthed bylaw 518, which prohibits noise in or on the streets liable to cause a nuisance. There must be no more noise, joked the cartoonist. Soup slurping was out, so was loud dresses. Silencers would be attached to loud complainants and swearers and blatherers, and electioneering would be nigh on impossible, especially for the likes of Jack Lang. As for the bookmakers, the race book sellers and the paper sellers, they'd have to whisper. Of course, this is tongue-in-cheek, but cartoons always are riffing off a current issue. And this was indeed related to contemporary noise issues. Complaints about newspaper sellers were commonly received by the municipal council. Many of the boys living in Darlinghurst worked as news vendors and paper sellers, earning vital shillings to supplement the family's meagre earnings. They worked not only at key tram stops and junctions such as Taylor Square during the week, but on Sunday mornings, they wandered through the suburb, touting the Sunday papers. Shouted headlines announced each new edition. The chorus regularly began at 6 a.m. Their voices were described in various letters of complaints as cross-cut saws, and their billy carts rattled along the streets. After multiple complaints, inspectors were directed to warn the young boys not to make undue noise, or they'd be liable for prosecution under bylaw 518. These warnings had little effect. And anyway, the council records show that the inspectors were actually loath to fine the lads who were merely trying to earn a few extra shillings for the family. So in the end, the council appealed to the newspaper proprietors to try and quell the noise. And this cartoon was actually published just after the council wrote to the newspaper proprietors. Aside from being lampooned, their request had little effect. Now, the council's legislation was updated in 1924 to come in line with broader local government legislation. And this empowered them to further regulate and control noise. The noise provisions targeted two different types of noise: relentless modern industrial noise of machinery and combustion engines, and secondly, noise that was coming from premises that might be considered objectionable or at unreasonable hours. So this is now moving from the public sphere into the private sphere of not only business premises, but also residences of individuals and families. 1926 was the first time that the City Council tried to introduce new noise prevention bylaws. It was led by the City Health Officer, Dr. Purdy, and supported by the City Solicitor, TWK Waldron. They framed some bylaws that established a right to peaceful rest between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. They identified potential noises to include birds and animals, machinery, combustion engines, and any noise deemed objectionable and a public nuisance on a premises or in the street. For these bylaws to work, they proposed that the people would be first given an order to cease and desist. And if they didn't do that, then they could be fined £10. So these were tabled in Parliament, in the Municipal Council, and passed very quickly. But for bylaws to become law, they had to be not only adopted by the Municipal Council, but then they had to be submitted to the state government for approval and the governor's consent. When the bylaws passed in council in 1926, all of the newspapers gleefully reported how noise would now be dampened. Everyone assumed that the bylaws would be automatically ratified by the state government. The powers were there in the legislation. But it was not to be. the state government challenged council's authority to control noise. And for the next 20 years, the state government and the municipal council went back and forth. Every time that the city attempted to pass bylaws to control noise, the state government came back and saying, well, we don't think you can really do this. So as the 1920s progressed, discussion about noise continued amongst civic leaders, medical practitioners, and the general public. These discussions were facilitated through the newspapers. Noise was described as a nuisance. It was described as a menace for civilization. The City Health Officer published a serialised article in the Sydney Morning Herald arguing relentless city noises, quote, seriously affected the nervous system of citizens. And he called a conference of medicos to Sydney Town Hall to discuss the noise nuisance. The idea of noise being debilitating to health was picked up and socialised in the media. For example, The Sun wrote that a great deal of nervous trouble of this generation is caused by sheer, unremitting, useless noise. And in this particular article, they pointed to loudspeakers, jazz palaces, and noisy neighbours as the most common culprits. But frustrated that there was all this discussion and nothing happening, the residents started forming their own protest groups, and there were anti-noise campaigns. The first one formed was the New South Wales Noise Abatement Society in March of 1928. Counted among their members were doctors, council aldermen, and concerned citizens, including several women. And in their meetings, they canvassed a range of irritants, including, according to the newspapers, chickens, garbage men handling dustbins at 2 a.m, milkmen rattling a devilish tattoo in the early morning, yelling newsboys, howling fish vendors and bottle-os, noisy cars, and motorbikes screaming like Gatling guns. So they weren't just complainers though. They did debate the legal aspects of noise control. They sought to work with the NRMA and also the newly formed Town Planning Association. And of course, they were making representations to government at a local government level and also a state government level. But they made little impact. 12 months later, in 1929, a correspondent wrote to the Daily Telegraph and says, when is the alleged Noise Abatement Society going to do something? It has been in existence for some time, and yet the trams still clank and clatter. The trains still shriek. The milkmen and bakers still yodel in the early morning. And the chemists are still coining money out for the nerve tonics and sedatives. We move forward another 10 years, and the council, the Noise Abatement Society, was still struggling with this very modern problem. So another society was formed, the Noise and Nuisance Abatement Society, to try and get more traction. Now, noise nuisances were being described now as assault. They met with the Premier in 1937 to lobby for better regulation. And the list of unacceptable noises presented to the Premier and reported in the Sun newspaper show how this society was starting to get more extreme in their views. You may not be able to read it all, but they went on, this was their list. They said that the milkmen between 3 and 5 a.m, and they not only bang their tins, but they whistle and wake people. And of course, the noise of those horse hoofs and cartwheels. Then you've got, of course, the early tram travellers who talk loudly in the tram sheds from 4:30 a.m, annoying people nearby. Buses, always noisy. Motorists, and especially motorcyclists, who keep their engine running. Hawkers, and they carry on, they should be made to be carrying on their occupation quietly. Noisy children, going to school in the morning, how dare they? Yelling and screeching in the streets, again and at midday, at lunchtime, and then going home. Oh, and as for radio hoodlums and the radio nuisance, well, they said it was becoming absolutely intolerable. So here you can see they're kind of presenting the extreme example of the noises that were being encountered every day by residents in the city, but also, it would be said, in some of the suburbs. But the last few are particularly probably relevant to Darlinghurst. There were garages where they made noises in the neighbourhood of residences. So that's garages where people are hiring cars and parking cars and so on. Hoodlums who are just behaving noisily in the streets at night. Parties where guests are noisy and finish by shouting good nights to one another in the street. And street talkers who just stand in the street at night debating things in loud voices. But what all of this, this emergence of anti-noise campaign and these different community groups and protests focus on, I guess, what is considered unnecessary or preventable noise. And I guess is trying to seek some sort of discussion, but also remedy for closer living and for density of living. And I think this is something that is a debate which is still going on today. The thing, of course, we also have to be aware of is who makes up these protest groups. Who are the people actually in them? Are they actually living in Darlinghurst? Well, we know that some of the early noise abatement groups included aldermen from the City of Sydney. So they were living within the City of Sydney local government area. And there were doctors. So there were professional people with true concern about the rising level of sound and the impact that might have on people's health. But then there were other people who were more about looking at what Paula was talking about earlier, about what modern life was and how people lived their lives. And some people who just wanted to get more involved and to regulate so that everything became a quieter suburban place, not sort of thinking about how the city might and different places might work in different ways with different demographics and different people. What's really interesting is also this impact in different technologies and the way that comes across into the public. So this is a really interesting example of new technology being used in 1937 for the first time, and it happened in Darlinghurst. They were using loudspeakers for electioneering in 1937. A United Australia Party candidate, H.H. Mason, broadcast from 14 loudspeakers placed across the rooftops of Darlinghurst. And it was reported in the newspapers that it was heard as far afield as Mossman and Paddington. And you can imagine this at night. Sound often travels a lot further at night and across the water as well. Sound travels very well across the water. And so this is probably why they could hear. I'm sure they couldn't hear every word in Mossman, but clearly they could hear it. And so this was considered an innovation, but not one that everyone particularly welcomed. While the politician himself didn't receive any immediate noise complaints, the council and the noise abatement societies did fret that the escalation of these broadcast methods. They thought the prospects were horrible and that bedlam might develop in the coming federal election if something is not done now. But this was more a bit of a novelty. More commonly, complaints in Darlinghurst were about loud music, revelry in parties, shrieking women, and also generally the nightlife, because Darlinghurst and King's Cross in particular was becoming known for its nightlife. And while the council was seeking to regulate noise, they also understood that certain precincts, such as King's Cross, was known for its loud and late night sounds. So there is an example we've come across in 1940 of the City Council receiving complaints from local residents about piano music emanating from a late night coffee shop known as the California Cafe. The complaint was debated at a committee council meeting, and several aldermen questioned why, given the locality, anything should be done at all. The city solicitor suggested that they could request the occupier to cease playing at 11:30 p.m. However, one of the Alderman Howie, retorted, "I think its most objectionable hour for playing music at King's Cross would be 7 o'clock in the morning. They don't get up till noon." So you can see these differing understandings about what is noise and what is acceptable noise and what is unreasonable hours. These are all fluid things that are very difficult to define and also to regulate and prosecute on. So while the diversity of new sounds encountered in the interwar period were tolerated, by the late 1940s, it's clear from the records in the municipal archive that the novelty had well and truly worn off. Apartment residents in Darlinghurst and King's Cross were regular complainants now of nighttime noise. Traffic noise and congestion was increasing, and with it, complaints about noisy vehicles and particularly motorbikes. But there was very little that the City Council could do. Sydney Municipal Council was still waiting for legislation from the state government to give them the ability to effectively regulate and control noise. So by the late 1940s, the New South Wales Health Department was on the case, launching a social welfare campaign with billboard posters and newsreel films to encourage the reduction of unnecessary noise. But change would be a long time coming. Into the 1950s, Sydney Municipal Council and the Health Department were still lobbying for regulatory improvements. And it was not until 1975, with the passing of the Noise Control Act, that New South Wales finally got legislation to deal with offensive noise. So on one level, we can see the 20th century as being a story of attempts by various local authorities and citizens to control sound in space and across time as well. But I think as Paul and I have shown, there's also a new awareness about sounds growing, and the whole impact of technology and modern life in perceptions of noise means that it is a very, it is something that is particular in history, and you have to think about the context of it when looking at all of these complaints. What is termed objectionable noise varied according to many different factors, including social class, age, location, but also how people responded to modernising technologies. And some writers have argued that noise was not about being representative of the modern. Noise was the modern in a way, in audible form. And so the historical record reveals that complaints and discussions about noise allowed people living in Darlinghurst to express through their senses and emotions actually what it felt like to be living in modern times. Thanks. And I'm just going to invite Paula up again, and we've got time for a few questions. Olivia's going to be handing a microphone round so that people who are listening in at home can also hear the questions. And I think if you are at home, you are able to, in the Q&A, to put a question, and that will be shared with us too. So do we have any questions?
Yes. All right, I'll bring in, please, everyone. Just make sure you speak into the mic so everyone can hear you at home.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I'm interested to know, if there wasn't a Noise Abatement Act until 1975, did they find other ways and use other regulations and to contain the noise by pretending it was something else?
So they could do, the only other remit was really through the bylaws through local government, and there were some limited laws through the police. They could control some motor traffic, but this is the problem when it becomes very siloed about who could deal with what, and everyone's powers were very small. So the council had a lot of difficulty getting bylaws passed that would allow them to control noise in private places. It was seen that they could control things in the public space, so that sort of the reticence of the state government to allow councils to actually help regulate living and create sort of community consensus around what is acceptable for residential areas was very difficult. I think while Paula and we focused in on the city of Sydney area, local government area, what would be really interesting and what we hope to do in the future is to look at some other suburban councils and to see what sort of complaints they might have been receiving. But of course, it's going to be reliant on the records that are held in those places. But I think, there's going to be some variation. And so, 1975, 1970, there was some other sort of state pollution control commission was established. So they started using that. And out of that then came the noise control specifically in 1975. But it was really difficult.
Yep. Do we have any other questions around? Sarah.
Yes, that was terrific. Thanks. Did you come across many neighbourhood complaints in terms of noise, generating police action? And I was thinking, I mean, the point about looking at the suburbs would be interesting too, because I think the most common noise complaint would be dogs in suburbs, dogs barking. And I wonder whether you found much of that in Darlinghurst.
In Darlinghurst, there was no real complaints about dogs barking specifically. It was more around hawkers and vendors, and sometimes it was also around, it was definitely around motor lorries and motorbikes. It was more those sorts of things. I think it's interesting in earlier periods, there's complaints about some animals because there are regulations about different animals that could be kept and not kept. So when goats got banned, this is much earlier, sort of late 19th century, when goats were banned, there were lots of people complaining about goats if people were still surreptitiously keeping them in their terrace backyards for the fresh milk and things like that. It really does sort of change over time, and I think it is quite particular. Yeah. And there was another part to your question. That's really hard to follow through, because you have to, unless they might complain to the police, unless the police complain to the city council, it's pass it on to the city council or vice versa. It's quite hard to follow through. And
Until they got violent. My impression is, in fact, that there was a lot of neighbourhood noise and a lot of complaints about it, but it went, as Lisa says, to the police. But even if it wasn't violent, it went to the police. But it occurs to me, that people must have had to tolerate a certain level or learn to tolerate, because I remember doing an interview with someone who lived in Balmain who was in the early part of the period, who was having a bath, right? And he yells out to his mother, "What's for dinner, mum?" And the person next door could hear it really loudly and clearly. So they must have been able to had to tolerate or learn to tolerate a certain level of hearing.
And I mean, that still happens today.
Yeah.
My neighbour has the same ringtone as me on my phone. And often when I'm sitting out the back of my house in the inner west, I hear the phone go off, but it's my neighbour's phone. It's not mine. So I think the idea about neighbours and what you can hear is very interesting. And I think, again, those expectations change depending where you live and the types of dwellings that you live in.
And the concept of privacy changes too.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many things that we have to think about and historicize and really pinpoint back to the period to come to an understanding and a real sort of sense of what the sensory environment was like.
We have had a question here.
From about the 1890s onwards, I think, Sydney has been a never-ending construction site. I'm really surprised that none of these people have complained about the building that was going on or the demolition that was going on. I grew up in Darlinghurst in the 1960s, and one of my big soundscape memories is a jackhammer.
Oh, really? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, there were some complaints around construction noise as well. And that was something that they were able to regulate a little bit more than other types of noise because it was dealt with under different legislation. They could deal with that a bit more through the consent, the development application consent process. So there was a little bit of control under that, but that doesn't mean they're not still getting complaints. But in like the period that we were looking at through the 20s, 30s and 40s, one of the major complaints that came out was the noise of building the graving dock down at Woolloomooloo.
That's right. Yeah, no, I was
Anything else?
just
Yeah.
agreeing with you. I just remembered. Yeah.
We'll have time for about just one more question.
Hi, thank you for today. I'm just wondering, you called it the sounds and noises of Darlinghurst, but on the map, it was really Woolloomooloo and Woolloomooloo Heights. How did you come up with Darlinghurst as the label?
So that map was just the map that I could fit onto the slide. So as Paula explained, we went back to consider Darlinghurst along Oxford Street, which was not shown on that map, and so on. So we used roughly the boundaries of what the ward was, Fitzroy Ward was at the time, and because Woolloomooloo was often considered part of Darlinghurst as well, on and off. Yeah, just as the cross was. So again, that's a sort of historical thing that changes over time, concepts of locality, and there wasn't a firm boundary, but we tried to keep it pretty much north of, just around the edges of Oxford Street and then moving north. Yeah.
Yep.
So there was a question just from the audience shouted out about pubs and pubs on the street. That was a constant thing, but by 1916, they introduced 6 o'clock closing. And so the pubs all shut at 6 o'clock. So there was often rowdiness for another hour or so as everyone's going home. And that's really supported in lots of oral histories from the period. But there weren't as many complaints unless there were brawls or things like that. It was because it all dissipated before it was at a time that the council would really be becoming concerned about it.
Thank you so much. That's about all we have time for today. But yeah, thank you, Lisa and Paula. That was such a fantastic talk. And thank you to everyone who's joined us online as well. And it's pretty packed out here, which is lovely to see. We do have another 2 talks for Heritage Festival coming up, one next Thursday and one the Thursday after in this space as well. So I'll send out an email to all of you kind of with the QR code if you'd like to leave some feedback on this talk. I'll include some links for those talks coming up as well. Thank you all for joining us today.